Okay. Part 13. How does structural violence, as I describe it in the chapter, impact the lives of Nigerian women? So I try to give a comprehensive analysis, at least as much as is possible in one chapter, of structural violence in Nigeria, how the lives of women are impacted. I present a detailed examination of structural violence in Nigeria and its profound impact on women. This form of violence is embedded in the social, political, and economic structures of the nation, systematically marginalizing women, denying them equal opportunities, and hindering their access to resources, rights, and representation. So, there are two parts to this that I kind of look at. One is economic deprivation, and the second is limited political participation. So let's take the first, economic deprivation. Structural violence manifests in the economic realm through policies and practices that restrict women's access to essential resources such as land, credit, and employment opportunities. This economic marginalization often traps women in poverty, limiting their ability to participate in politics due to a lack of financial resources and social capital. The sources specifically the sources of this that I kind of look at are those that highlight the devastating impact of structural adjustment programs on women. And I argue that these neoliberal economic policies have exacerbated poverty and inequality for all citizens and residents of Nigeria. But it proportionately affects women in the following ways. And I kind of talk about three effects. One is that women's employment opportunities in the public sector are reduced. And two, that cutting of social services that women rely on, including healthcare and education, also significantly disadvantages them. Three, that the burden of unpaid care work in families increases for women because they have to find ways of enabling their families to cope with the fallout of structural adjustment programs. Okay, programs and the policies that are involved in implementing the program. So I also talk, the second thing I said I focus on in this section in terms of how structural violence impacts the lives of women is in terms of limiting women's political participation. So structural violence creates a hostile environment for women in politics. And I give 15 ways in which structural violence limits women's political participation. The first is electoral violence. When it is directed at women candidates and voters, is a tool of intimidation that discourages women from engaging in the political process. Second is discriminatory laws and practices, often rooted in customary traditions and patriarchal interpretations of religion. These limit women's legal capacity and hinders their ability to own property, enter into contracts, and gain full autonomy. There's also a third, unequal access to resources and networks. This further disadvantages women because they often lack the financial means, connections, and mentorship opportunities that are available to their male counterparts. Fourth, there are internalized patriarchal norms that are embraced by both men and women that also reinforce the perception that politics is a male domain, leading to a lack of support for women, candidates, and pressure on female politicians to conform to traditional expectations. So I argue that this multifaceted system of structural violence results in the following things. One is the underrepresentation of women in political decision making, despite Nigeria's aspiration that it's going to achieve 35% benchmark for women's representation in appointive positions and elected positions. And we find a situation where the percentage of women in elected and appointed positions continues to decline. This lack of representation denies women a voice in shaping policies that impact their lives and perpetuates their marginalization. Then you also have tokenistic gestures rather than meaningful change. I criticize the government's approach to addressing gender inequality in politics. I argue that it often focuses on appointing a small number of women to high visibility positions without addressing the underlying structural barriers that hinder women's broader participation. There's also the erosion of education and security. Structural violence extends beyond the economic and political spheres, impacting women's access to education and their personal security. Let's take, for example, the abduction of the Chibok girls by Boko Haram and relate it to the broader context of structural violence. The state's failure to provide adequate security for schools, particularly in marginalized and poor regions, reflects a disregard for the welfare of students, particularly girls. This insecurity creates a chilling effect on girls' education, and it undermines their future prospects and perpetuates cycles of poverty and vulnerability. Furthermore, I emphasize how patriarchal norms that prioritize male education over female education contribute to gender disparities in educational attainment, limiting women's opportunities for economic empowerment and social mobility. The consequences of structural violence on women in Nigeria are far-reaching. It not only undermines their individual well-being, but also hinders the country's overall development and progress. So entrenched poverty and inequality create a drag on economic growth as women's potential contributions are stifled. The lack of women's voices in decision-making processes leads to policies that fail to adequately address the needs and concerns of half the population. There's also the fact that the persistence of violence and insecurity generates instability and undermines social cohesion. Addressing this deeply entrenched system of structural violence requires a comprehensive and sustained effort. Also, legal and policy reforms are needed to dismantle discriminatory laws and practices and promote gender equality and ensure women's full access to rights and resources. Further, investments in education and economic empowerment programs are crucial to provide women with the skills and opportunities to break free from cycles of poverty and dependence. Also, efforts to challenge patriarchal norms and promote gender-sensitive attitudes and behaviors are essential to create a more equitable and just society. Then, addressing the root causes of conflict and insecurity, including poverty, inequality, and marginalization, is critical to ensure the safety and well-being of all citizens, particularly women and girls. Finally, holding the state accountable for its obligations to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of gender, is paramount. Only through a concerted effort to dismantle the structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice can Nigeria achieve its full potential and ensure a brighter future for all its citizens, including women. So this is the end of this section, which is part 13 of what I said in chapter 6 of Gender and Development in Nigeria.